In the spring of 2009, a sales agronomist named Curtis Vance stood at the edge of a 40-acre grain field in Tama County, Iowa, looked at the lean, uneven rows of an old wheat the owner could not even sell to the elevator, and told a room of farmers that the man growing it was a sentimental fool who would be bankrupt inside 3 years. 14 years later, in the autumn of 2023, that same wheat went into bread that a buyer in Chicago paid $11 a loaf for, wholesale, by the thousand, and the man who grew it signed a single purchase order worth more than the agronomist would earn in a decade. The distance between those two moments is the story I want to tell you, because it ran 13 years through a pile of wet brewery waste dumped against a fence, and almost nobody who watched it happen understood what they were looking at. The man's name was Halmar Bose. He was 61 in that spring of 2009, the grandson of a Frisian immigrant who had come to the river bottom country east of Toledo, Iowa, with a canvas sack of seed wheat sewn into the lining of his coat. Halmar was known for two things in the county. He was the quietest man at any gathering, the kind who would let a whole conversation pass without adding a word, and he grew the strangest wheat anyone there had ever seen. It was tall, nearly waist-high, with a reddish cast to the straw, and a head that shattered easy if you let it stand too long. The elevator would not take it. It did not meet the protein grade the mills wanted, and it threshed light, and a man at the cooperative had once called it a weed with ambitions. Halmar farmed 240 acres, owned free and clear, with a 1968 blue Ford tractor that he had rebuilt twice. And he kept growing that wheat when every piece of advice he ever received told him to plow it under. Let me tell you about the wheat, because the wheat is the whole thing. It was a landrace, which is the plain word for a crop that has never been bred into uniformity by a company. It was not one variety. It was a population, hundreds of slightly different plants growing in the same field, some taller, some shorter, some early, some late, some with awns and some without, all of them descended from the seed in that coat lining. His grandfather had called it the home wheat. Halmar called it nothing at all. He just grew it, saved the best heads each August in cloth bags hung from the rafters of the granary, and planted them again in October. Stay with me on this, because the thing that looked like backwardness was the most sophisticated thing on that whole road, and it would take a drought, a fungus, and a baker from the city to prove it. The brewery came to Toledo in 1996. It was a regional outfit, expanded fast, and by the late 90s it was mashing 40,000 pounds of barley and wheat a week to make its beer. Brewing leaves behind a wet, heavy mess called spent grain, the husks and the hulls and the cracked kernels after the sugars have been boiled out of them. A brewery that size produced tons of it a day. It spoiled within 48 hours, it stank when it turned, and hauling it to the landfill cost real money. So in the spring of 1996, a man from the brewery drove out to the farms along the river road, asking if anyone would take it off their hands for free. And most farmers said no, because spent grain is low in the things that fatten cattle fast, and it sours into a slimy gray heat if you pile it up. Halmar said they could put it against his east fence line. He did not tell them why. He was not a man who explained himself. The brewery was glad to have a place to dump it that was closer than the county landfill, and a truck began arriving twice a week and tipping a wet brown load against the fence at the bottom of Halmar's East 40. This went on in the end for 13 years. To the brewery, it was a disposal solution, a line item that went to zero. To the neighbors, it was an eyesore and a smell that drifted on a south wind. To Halmar, it was the slowest and richest thing a man could build, and he had read about it in a notebook his grandfather kept, in Frisian, in a hand that slanted hard to the right. Curtis Vance was not a bad man. I want to be fair to him, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he was not one. He was 34 in 2009, a graduate of a good agricultural college, sharp with a spreadsheet, genuinely trying to help the farmers in his territory. He sold seed and the chemistry that went with it for one of the large suppliers, and he believed, the way a man believes in arithmetic, that the future of grain was uniformity, high inputs, and scale. He had data. His hybrids really did outyield the old wheats by a wide margin in a good year on good ground. He looked at Halmar's reddish, uneven, waist-high field, and he saw the past, and he was not entirely wrong about what it could not do. He was wrong about something else, something his numbers had no column for, and it would take 14 years for that to come due. The meeting was at the Tama County Extension Office in March, a winter growers' seminar. 40 men in folding chairs with coffee and foam cups and the smell of the radiators ticking against the cold outside. Vance had a slide projector and a laser pointer and a presentation about maximizing return per acre. He was good at it. He talked about protein premiums and falling numbers and the genetics that would let a man push past 80 bushels on irrigated ground, and the slides showed clean bar charts climbing left to right, and the men in the chairs leaned forward because every one of them was doing arithmetic against a thin margin, and here was a young man with a college degree telling them how to widen it. Near the end, he took questions, and someone asked, half joking, what he made of the old red wheat bows grew down on the river. Vance smiled. He was friendly about it, which was the worst of it. That, he said, is a hobby, not a crop. He said a man could keep a museum if he liked, but a museum does not pay a mortgage, and that the kindest thing the seed industry had ever done for farming was free men from the burden of saving their own seed. He let the word sentimentality out into the warm room and let it sit there gently, the way you correct a child you are fond of. Halmar was in the back row. He did not own a foam cup. He had come for the soil chemistry portion earlier in the afternoon and had stayed in his seat out of courtesy, his hat on his knee, his hands folded. When the laughter went around the room, he did not change his face at all. He did not flush. He did not look down. He did not look up. A neighbor named Del Prosca, 2 seats over, watched him not react, and felt embarrassed for him. The second-hand embarrassment a man feels for someone who does not seem to know he has been made small. Del would remember that moment, years later after his own model had failed him, and understand it completely differently, but on that March afternoon, he only felt sorry for the quiet old man who grew the weed wheat. Halmar said one thing on the way out, to Del, in the gravel lot with his hat already on. The man's never grown a thing he couldn't buy again, he said. Then he got in the Ford pickup and drove home. That was the whole of his rebuttal. He did not write a letter to the paper. He did not argue. He went back to the work, and the work by then had a 13-year head start that nobody in that room could see. Let me tell you what was happening against that fence, because it is the mechanism the whole story turns on, and it is real, and you can understand it in 5 minutes. When you pile wet spent grain in the open, it does not simply rot. It composts, which is a different and a slower process. The bacteria and the fungi in it begin to break the husks down, and the pile heats from the inside, sometimes to 150 degrees, hot enough to steam on a cold morning. Over a season, that heat falls and the worms come up into it, and what was a sour gray slop becomes In 18 months to 2 years, a black, crumbling material that smells like a forest floor. Spent grain is unusually rich in two things: nitrogen and carbon, both, in a ratio close to ideal for this. Halmar's grandfather had composted brewery waste in the old country, where the breweries and the small farms had lived beside each other for centuries. And he had written down in the notebook how to layer it, how to turn it, how long to let it lie. Halmar did exactly that. Twice a week the brewery added to the raw end of the pile, and twice a year Halmar moved the finished end, by tractor and by fork, out onto the East 40, where his wheat grew. This is the part the spreadsheet could not hold. The modern way to raise wheat is to feed the plant directly, with soluble nitrogen out of a bag, in precise amounts, timed to the growth stage. It works, and it works fast, and it is easy to measure, which is exactly why a man like Vance trusted it. What Halmar was doing instead was feeding the soil, and through the soil, slowly, the plant. It added carbon, and carbon is what holds water and air in the ground, and gives the fungi and the bacteria and the worms something to live in. Underneath a healthy field runs a whole hidden economy. Threads of fungus laced through the roots, trading sugar for minerals the plant could never reach on its own, and that economy lives on carbon and dies without it. Year after year, load after load, the East 40 was becoming something the chemical fields around it were not. Its dark topsoil was getting deeper, a quarter-inch a year, an inch every 4, which is nothing to a man in a hurry and everything to a man building for his grandchildren. A handful of it held together in a moist crumb instead of running through the fingers like dust. Rain soaked into it instead of sheeting off. None of this showed up at the elevator. None of it was worth $1 that any market in Iowa knew how to price. It was, on every balance sheet anyone would have shown, a banker, a smell, and an eyesore, and a stubborn old man's waste of 40 acres. I want you to hold the foil in your mind while this builds, because the contrast is the whole verdict. Del Praska farmed 1,200 acres on the high ground north of Halmar, and Del did everything right. Del was the model Vance held up. He ran a new self-propelled sprayer, a green machine that cost $300,000 and could cover 100 acres an hour. He planted the certified hybrids, applied the chemistry on the calendar. Vance helped him build, and in a good year he grew beautiful uniform wheat that graded out and sold the day it was cut. Del had also borrowed against nearly all of it. The land, the machines, the bins, the operating loan that floated the seed and the chemical and the diesel each spring. He was not reckless. He was conventional. In the exact way the whole county was conventional, and the whole county admired him for it. When people drove past Del's even green fields, and then past Halmar's reddish uneven ones, they knew which man was the farmer and which was the relic. Let me tell you about the notebook, since it is the inheritance the deed never mentioned. Halmar's grandfather, Jord, had died in 1971, and what he left was the 240 acres, the granary full of seed in cloth bags, and a leather notebook gone soft as cloth at the corners. It was written in Frisian, and Halmar's mother had translated the important pages for him when he was a young man, reading them aloud at the kitchen table under a single hanging bulb, while he wrote the English in the margins in pencil. The pages were not poetry. They were instructions and observations. How deep to plant in a wet fall, which heads to save from a dry year, and which from a wet one, so the saved seed carried both kinds of survival in it. how to read the smell of a compost pile, to know whether it needed air or water. One sentence Helmar's mother had translated, and Helmar had underlined, and it became the closest thing the man had to a creed. As Jord had written, "A field you feed will feed you once. A field you build will feed your grandchildren." Helmar was building. He had been building since he was a boy, and the man with the laser pointer had called it a hobby. His granddaughter, Wren, came home in the summer of 2014. She was 26, with a degree in food science from a university out east, and 2 years at a large commercial bakery behind her, where she had learned the industrial way of making bread, which is fast and dependent on additives, and built on a few high-protein wheat varieties bought by the rail car. She loved her grandfather, and she was a little ashamed of his farm, the way the educated young are ashamed of the things that raised them. She had absorbed, without quite knowing it, every assumption Vance had stood on at that podium. The first thing she said, walking the East 40 with him that June, was that he should test the soil and quit guessing. She said he was leaving yield on the table. She said the red wheat was interesting, but it would never mill consistently enough to sell, that bakeries need uniformity, that a flour that changes from field to field and year to year is a flour no commercial baker can use. She was not wrong about the industry she had trained in. She was measuring a land race by the standards of a commodity, and she did not yet know there was any other standard. Helmar did not argue with her either. He handed her the notebook. He told her to read the pages her great-great-grandfather wrote, and then he took her down to the compost, windrows along the fence, and put a handful of the finished black crumble in her palm and told her to smell it. She did. It smelled like the floor of a woods. He took her 10 feet across the fence to where a neighbor's chemically farmed ground began, and put that soil in her other hand, and it was pale and dead, and it poured away. He did not give a speech. He let the 2 handfuls of dirt make the argument, and he watched his granddaughter, the food scientist, go quiet looking at them. Something turned in her that afternoon. Not all the way. It turned anyway, quietly, the way a thing turns that cannot be argued back. What turned it further was the milling. Late that summer, almost to humor him, Wren took a 5-gallon bucket of the red wheat to a stone mill an hour away and ground it whole, and she baked with it in her grandmother's kitchen with nothing but flour and water and salt and the wild yeast she caught off the air of the old granary. The bread that came out was unlike anything she had made in 2 years at the commercial bakery. It was deep and faintly sweet and a little nutty, with a crumb the color of cream and a crust that crackled. It kept for days without going to stone. She made it again to be sure it was not luck. It was not luck. The landrace, the very thing that made it useless to the elevator, the genetic variety packed into that population, was exactly what gave the flour its flavor and its strength. She had spent 2 years learning to compensate, with additives and dough conditioners, for the blandness of commodity flour. Here was a flour that needed none of it. She stood in her grandmother's kitchen at 11 at night holding a warm loaf, a food scientist who had been taught that uniformity was quality. And she understood, all at once, that she had been taught exactly backward. This was the midpoint, and it felt like a victory. And it was not one yet. Knowing the bread was extraordinary and getting anyone to pay for it are 2 different things. And the second is much harder than the first. Wren spent the next 2 years learning the second. She and Helmar planted a little more of the red wheat carefully, never more than the composted ground could carry, because the bread depended on the soil, and the soil could not be rushed. She built a small mill in a corner of the granary, a stone burr unit she bought used from a closing bakery in Wisconsin, and she learned to run it. Learned that you cannot grind a landrace the way you grind commodity wheat, that the varied kernels demanded a slower feed and a patient hand on the gap, or the flour came out scorched and flat. She kept a logbook beside the mill the way her great-great-grandfather had kept his, noting the moisture of each batch, the smell of the meal as it fell, the way one autumn's wheat milled sweeter than the last. She drove loaves to farmers' markets in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, setting up a folding table at 6 in the morning with a cloth over it and a basket of dark round loaves and nothing else, no sign explaining what it was, because she had not yet learned to explain it. She sold some. She gave away more, tearing pieces off a loaf for anyone who slowed down, and she watched their faces, and the only thing she trusted was the half-second when a person stopped chewing and looked down at the bread in their hand as if it had asked them a question. That half-second happened again and again. A retired schoolteacher came back 4 Saturdays running and finally asked, almost angry, why no other bread tasted like this anymore. Wren did not have the whole answer yet. She only had the soil and the seed and a grandfather who would not explain himself, and a slowly growing certainty that the thing the world had thrown away was the thing worth building a life on. It was slow. It did not look, to anyone watching, like a young woman with a future. It looked like a smart girl wasting an expensive degree on her grandfather's hobby. Vance's word had a long reach, and it reached even into the markets where she stood, because more than one farmer she knew walked past her table with a nod that held more pity than respect. She kept setting the table up anyway. She kept tearing off the pieces. She was running her own slow experiment, and the results, like the soil, only showed up if you were willing to wait for them. And the foil was rising. Through 2014, 2015, 2016, Del Praska was the picture of how it was supposed to work. Commodity wheat prices were decent. His big new sprayer ran. His uniform fields graded #1, and he expanded, leasing another 400 acres and borrowing to do it. He had nearly 1,700 acres under the modern system now, all of it certified hybrid wheat and corn, all of it fed from a bag, all of it riding on the assumption that next year would look like this year. Vance pointed to Dell at his seminars. Here, he would say, and the laser dot would settle on a photograph of Dell's even green fields stretching to the horizon, is a farmer who understands that scale and uniformity and the right inputs are how you survive. The room would nod. Dell was the future, and Halmar was the past. And in 2016 there was not a person in Tama County, except maybe a food scientist standing in a granary at night with a warm loaf in her hands, who would have bet on the past. Then came the 2 years that settled it. Let me tell you about them plainly, because they are where the structural reckoning fell, and it fell hardest on exactly the man who had done everything by the book. The summer of 2017 was a drought. Not a catastrophic one by the standards of the dust years, but a hard, long, rainless stretch from late June through August, the kind that comes once or twice a decade and tells the truth about a soil. The well-meaning radio agronomists called it a moisture deficit. The men in the field had a shorter word for it. On the high ground, Dell's uniform hybrid wheat, planted in soil that had been fed from a bag for 15 years and had lost most of its carbon to it, had nothing to draw on. Carbon in a soil works like a sponge, holding water in the small spaces between particles and giving it back slowly to the roots through a dry spell. And Dell's ground had almost none of it left, because soluble fertilizer feeds the plant and starves the soil life that builds the carbon in the first place. The ground baked to a pale crust you could have written your name in. What rain did fall in 2 August storms ran straight off it and pooled in the road ditches instead of soaking in. And a man could stand at the edge of Dell's field and watch his own water leave his own land. His even green fields went gray, then tan, and his yield came in at less than half of what his loan had been written against. Down on the river bottom, Halmar's East 40, with its deep, dark, spongy soil built from 13 years of brewery, compost, and 40 years of saved seed, held its water like a held breath. You could push a fence post into that ground in the worst week of August, and bring it up dark and damp 6 inches down. The landrace, with its hundreds of slightly different plants, did what uniformity cannot. Some of those plants were drought-shy and curled their leaves and waited out the worst of it. Others rooted deep and carried the field through. A monoculture meets a drought with one strategy. The single strategy bred into every identical plant in it, and if that strategy fails, the whole field fails together. A landrace meets a drought with 100 strategies at once, and a few of them always win, and the field, as a whole, never breaks. Halmar walked his wheat in the dry weeks and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The ground was doing what his grandfather had built it to do. The second blow was a fungus. In the wet, warm spring of 2018, a striped rust came through eastern Iowa, a disease that runs through uniform wheat like fire through dry grass, because every plant in a hybrid field is genetically identical, and what kills one can kill them all. The spores ride the wind, land on a leaf, and find 10,000 acres of the same susceptible plant waiting for them, an unbroken road with no fire break anywhere on it. Dell sprayed fungicide twice, at $4,000 a pass, timing it exactly the way Vance's calendar told him to, and still lost a third of his stand to the orange streaks that powdered off the leaves when you brushed them. Halmar sprayed nothing. He owned no sprayer worth the name. He could not have told you in a lab which of his plants resisted the rust and which did not, but his grandfather's notebook had told him to save seed from the healthiest heads every single year. And Halmar had done it for 40 years without fail, and across 40 years of saving, the field had quietly bred its own resistance into itself, plant by plant. The plants that got sick in a bad year did not make it into the seed bag. The plants that stood clean did. 40 years of that, repeated every August in the granary, had built a firewall of genetic difference into the population that no single disease could burn straight through. The rust took a little here and a little there, found a resistant plant, and stopped, and took a little somewhere else, and stopped again, and could never get a running start. He brought in a near-normal crop the same spring his neighbors lost a third of theirs, and he did it without spending $1 on chemistry, because the resistance was not in a jug, it was in the seed, and it had been free the whole time. Del Prosca did not lose the farm in one stroke. It went the way these things usually go slowly, and then all at once the drought year hit the loan. The rust year hit the loan again. The bank, which had been so comfortable with his uniform gradable wheat, grew less comfortable, and the operating line tightened. And by the autumn of 2018, Dell was selling equipment to make payments, the big green sprayer first, at auction, for less than half what he owed on it. I want to be careful here because Dell was not a fool. And this is not a story that mocks him. He had done precisely what the smartest people in the county told him to do. He had trusted a model that worked beautifully until the one year it did not, and the model had no answer for that year. That is the whole danger of mistaking the measurable for the durable. It looks like wisdom right up until the weather disagrees. Which brings us back to the bread, because by 2019, Wren's slow work had reached a baker who knew exactly what she was holding. Her name was Margot Fenn, and she ran a small, acclaimed bakery in Chicago that had built its reputation on the honest old way of making bread, long fermentation and whole grain, and nothing else in the bag. Wren had mailed her a single loaf, wrapped in butcher paper, with no pitch, no flyer, no price list. Just the bakery's address, copied off the back of a magazine, and a return address on the River Road. She had nearly not sent it at all. Margot Fenn had eaten bread on 4 continents, had trained in Paris and judged grain competitions, and was known in the trade as a woman who said no to almost everyone. She called the granary 2 days later. She did not ask the price. She did not ask about volume or shelf life or any of the things a commercial buyer asks first. She asked one question. She asked where the flavor came from. Wren told her. She told her about the landrace and the hundreds of different plants, about the compost built from 13 years of brewery waste against the fence, about the 40 years of seed saved by hand from the healthiest heads, about a Frisian grandfather and a leather notebook. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Wren thought the call had dropped. Then Margot Fenn said she would take every pound of flour they could mill, and she would pay what it was worth, and she did not want to negotiate. The number, when it came quietly. In the autumn of 2019, Margot Fenn drove down from Chicago herself 4 hours alone, and walked the East 40 with Hallmar and Wren in the low gold light of an October afternoon. She did not bring her contract first. She brought her hands. She knelt at the fence line where the brewery had once dumped its loads and pushed her fingers into the black-built soil and held a crumb of it to her nose for a long time, eyes closed, the way Wren had once held it, the way Hallmar had taught his granddaughter to. Then she stood, brushed off her hands, and asked them to sit down at the kitchen table, and she put a signed wholesale agreement in front of them under the single hanging bulb. The red wheat that the elevator would not take at any price, the weed with ambitions, the museum, the hobby, was going to sell as milled flour for more than $4 a pound, and the bread it became would sell in Chicago for $11 a loaf. On the 240 acres run carefully, never pushed past what the soil could carry. The gross return per acre against that agreement was not double what Dell's hybrid wheat had made in his best year. It was not triple. It was more than 7 times. Hallmar was 71 that autumn. He read the figure on the signed agreement, set it down on the kitchen table under the single hanging bulb, and did not say anything for a long while. The clock ticked on the wall. Margot Fenn did not fill the silence, because she was a person who understood that some numbers need room around them. He did not say he had told them so, because he had never told anyone anything. He looked at his granddaughter, who had come home, a food scientist. Sure, he was wasting his land, and who was now the one who would carry the wheat forward, and the loyal old collie named Tess, who had followed him down that fence line for 12 years, got up from the corner and lay down across his boots. The number sat on the table between the 3 of them. Nobody needed to say it twice. Curtis Vance heard about it the way the county heard about everything, slowly and then completely. And he was 44 by then, still selling seed, though the ground had shifted under that business in ways even he could feel. In the spring of 2020, he drove out to the River Road on his own, not selling anything, and he stood at the east fence where the brewery had dumped its waste for 13 years, and looked at the dark windrows and the deep wheat. Wren was there. She braced for the old condescension. It did not come. Vance was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked her a question. And the question was the recalibration, because it was the question of a man whose model had finally failed in front of him. He asked how the soil held water in 2017 when everything around it burned. He asked it plainly, the way a student asks, and he had a small notebook of his own in his hand, and he wrote down what she told him. He was not converted in an afternoon. The man who had called it a hobby stood at that fence and took notes, though, and that is a kind of conversion that means more than an apology. The brewery stopped delivering in 2009, as it happened the very year of the seminar, when it was bought by a national company that closed the local plant and moved its production 3 states away. Halmar had 13 years of finished compost. By then more than enough, a black bank of built soil that would feed the land race for the rest of his life, and well past it. He had never paid a cent for it. The brewery had paid him, in a sense, by hauling its problem to his fence twice a week for 13 years. And the thing the whole county had smelled and pitied and driven past, with the windows rolled up, had been the entire time the single richest thing on the road. Let me tell you what happened to the people in this story, because a verdict is not the same as an ending. Wren took over the milling and the growing and the selling, and within a few years she was working with 11 other small farms across eastern Iowa, selling them seed from the home wheat and teaching them the compost method and the saved seed discipline, building a little federation of landrace grain where there had been one stubborn field. They never grew it large. That was the point. The bread stayed expensive because the soil could not be rushed and the wheat could not be poured out of a bag. And Wren understood, as her grandfather had understood, that the value was in the limit. A flour you can make infinitely is worth nothing. A flour that can only come from one kind of patient ground, built slow and saved by hand, is worth $11 a loaf. Del Praska kept 80 acres of the home place out of the wreck, the 80 his own grandfather had broken, and in 2021 he drove down to Halmar's fence and asked, with some difficulty, because pride is the last thing a man sets down, whether the old man would show him how the compost was made. He stood in the gravel, turning his cap in his hands the way men do when they have come to ask for something they once made fun of. Halmar was past helping with a fork. By then, his hands gone to knots. Wren showed him. She walked Del down the windrows and put the black crumble in his palm the way her grandfather had once put it in hers and told him to smell it. And Del, who had farmed for 30 years and never once thought about what his soil smelled like, stood there, breathing in the smell of a forest floor with something working in his face. She told him it would take years. She did not soften it. The carbon his fields had lost over 3 decades would not come back in one season, and the compost had to be built, load by load, and turned and waited on, and the seed had to be saved by hand every August, and none of it could be poured out of a bag or rushed with a checkbook. Del planted 20 acres of the red wheat that fall with seed Wren gave him and would not sell him, the same way her grandfather had refused to sell his seed, because seed that is sold becomes a commodity and seed that is given stays a trust. He began at 59 to build a soil instead of feeding a plant. It was slower than anything he had ever done. It was also the first ground he had farmed in 30 years that he did not owe the bank a single dollar against. And on a quiet evening that first autumn he stood at the edge of those 20 reddish, uneven acres and understood, finally and completely, the thing he had felt sorry for Halmar about in a folding chair 12 years before. Halmar Bose died in the winter of 2024 at 76, a few months after that $11 loaf went into wholesale by the thousand. He did not die a man the world called wealthy, and he never once in his life called himself any of those words. He left the 240 acres to Wren, free and clear as he had received them, And he left her the granary full of seed in cloth bags, and he left her the soft leather notebook with the Frisian writing and the pencil English in the margins. On the last page, under his great-grandfather's hand, Wren added one line of her own in pen, the only thing she ever wrote in that book. She wrote down the date. The brewery first dumped its grain against the fence, and the date Margot Fenn signed the agreement, and the number of years between them, which was the same number of years the brewery had hauled its waste to a stubborn old man who knew exactly what he was being given. Here is the thing the spreadsheet could never hold, and it is worth saying plainly now that the story has earned it. A system measures what is easy to measure. It measures bushels in protein and yield per acre, and return on a single year. And by every one of those measures, Curtis Vance was right, and Halmar Bowes was a fool. A soil, though, is not built in a year, and a wheat is not bred in a season. And the things that matter most about a piece of ground, its carbon, its life, its memory of 40 droughts and 40 floods saved into the seed, are exactly the things no annual ledger has a column for. Vance measured the plant. Halmar built the field. The drought asked which of them had told the truth, and the field answered. What is fed lasts a season. What is built lasts past the man who built it. The home wheat still grows on the river bottom east of Toledo, reddish and uneven, and waist-high, and in the autumn an old collie's granddaughter walks the fence line, where the brewery waste once steamed,